Okay, we're going to go ahead and talk about the administration of John Adams, our nation's second president. It starts off, one of the first things to mention is really one of the first presidential scandals. It's known as the XYZ Affair. And what had happened is Adams had sent over his Secretary of State, John Jay, to negotiate a treaty with Great Britain. And the results of that treaty were that Great Britain would agree to leave the western lands of the United States, which they were still occupying years after the end of the American Revolution. And in return, they would be allowed to keep seizing American ships. They would have been seizing our ships and impressing our sailors into the British Navy. So Jay signs the treaty, thinking it's the best he can do, comes back, and it's absolutely tremendously unpopular. In fact, Jay was burned in effigy. In other words, they had little, John Jay dolls that they would hang and burn here in the United States. And it was also unpopular with our allies. The French, in particular, were upset with the Jay Treaty, and they were like, well, if Great Britain has the right to seize the ships, then so do we. And so the French began to seize American ships. So Adams sends some members of the State Department over to go ahead and talk with the French foreign minister. And the French foreign minister doesn't talk to him. He sends out three officials, XYZ, that's the XYZ Affair. And the officials basically say, hey, if you want to talk to the French foreign minister, it's going to cost you money. They were asking for a bribe to even start to talk about not seizing our ships anymore. And we say, we're not paying a bribe. And we go back. And it turns into a big scandal back home. And it ends when the French government dissolves and a new French government forms. Another problem that the Adams administration dealt with was something called sectionalism. Definition of sectionalism is putting regional interests over those of the nations, and it really manifests itself in political parties till this day. Back during the Adams administration, the South was primarily Republican, and the North were Federalists. And we still have this today, where certain regions tend to be of one political party and certain regions tend to be of another. This is something George Washington saw a lot of peril in. He really warned against that in his farewell address. Don't splinter the country. Somewhat prophetic, considering that in about 60 years, 70 years, we're going to be in a civil war. And we still struggle with it today, as is evidenced by some of the conflicts that go on in Washington with our political life in the country today. Other issues that the Adams administration dealt with when folks were criticizing the administration rather forcefully over stuff like the XYZ Affair, Adams gets Congress to pass the Alien and Sedition Acts. Provisions are that you had to live here for 14 years to become a citizen. A lot of people felt like that was too long, too stringent. Further, the president could order any alien out of the country. So if you weren't a citizen here, they could order you out for any reason the president wanted. Didn't need to give really a reason. Just said, I don't like them here, and get rid of them. President could jail aliens during wartime. So again, if you weren't a citizen here, if you were from a foreign country, you could just throw you in jail just because you were from a foreign country, and gave jail terms and fines to anyone who criticized the government. And this was the big, really controversial provision, because there were a lot of newspaper publishers who favored Jefferson's position. Adams was a Federalist, who were very critical of the president, and he would go ahead and fine them or give them jail times. And they correctly argued that this is a violation of the First Amendment, which protects freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And eventually the Alien and Sedition Acts were declared unconstitutional and repealed. The effects were Republican writers and publishers and editors of newspapers were jailed, and the states of Virginia and Kentucky passed resolutions declaring the Alien and Sedition Acts unconstitutional. The principle is called nullification. Can a state nullify a federal law? Can they say a federal law is unconstitutional? There's a lot of arguments surrounding this, and has been a continuing issue throughout our nation's history. How much power do the states actually have, and how much power does the federal government actually have? Enter into the fray John Marshall, who himself was a Federalist. He's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he will start to bring some clarification, at least from a constitutional perspective, to this argument. He is appointed by Adams, so Marshall is a Federalist, and he is definitely one of the first attempts by the Federalists to stack the court in their favor. People say, well, Supreme Court justices, appointments shouldn't be political. They've always been political from the very first, including John Marshall, arguably our nation's greatest Chief Justice. He was a political appointee. Adams appointed him because he was a Federalist and would interpret the Constitution in a similar way to what the Federalists deemed to be favorable.